cross, a river, for example, at a certain location, cross a railroad at a certain location, that would, constrain us to leave the pipeline really where it's at.
You've been here off and on the last couple of weeks listening to the non-intervening landowners testify. Is that correct?
I haven't been here in person for the non-intervening landowners, but I did listen into the majority of that through the live stream.
So in addition to hearing their testimony, I would assume you also may have evaluated the route around their structures and things at that time.
Yeah, I certainly, listened to their concerns and was looking at opportunities to see what we could do to try to accommodate their concerns.
I'm going to have the IUB staff bring up a couple of examples that we heard from, and I'm going to use the examples from the testimony just because that's already been made public, but just as examples to get an idea of the considerations that your routing team went through. So if the staff could pull up PA-013 on the KMZ file. Were you able to listen to Mr. Fair testify regarding his property and his son's properties?
I did not, but I am aware of this.
You're aware of the situation?
Yes.
Okay. And I'll try to paraphrase the testimony. I'm not going to get it perfect, but the farmstead there that's not red.
Yep.
There was testimony that he has approximately 70 H2A workers that live there. And he also testified that the pipeline, I believe, is about 250 feet from that area. What considerations would your routing team have made to leave that route that close to that population?
So our original route actually hugged the south part of that property all the way across. There was a straight line on the south part of those parcels. After the route was established and after, easement documents were presented to the landowner, that section that's not red was, subdivided. And there's, I believe, a large barn that's been constructed on the far south side of that property. So it forced us to adjust the route long into the process. I think we were well over a year and a half into the process and over a year into the process before that property was subdivided or any construction activities took place. We'd already submitted Exhibit H's and we had to file an amendment to adjust the route because the route was going right in that little red sliver, which I think is only about 80 foot wide. It's not even wide enough to construct there. And it would be, I think, tens of feet from the existing barn that they just built. So that's what forced us to adjust the route in the manner that we did. Certainly, if we could adjust the route even slightly further north if needed, and requested by the landowner to get an easement signed. But originally, the route was hugging the far south side of that property. We were, much further away from any inhabitable structure and, encumbering the property as little as possible by hugging the property line. And then, the lot was subdivided in the fashion that it was, which is rather odd looking, and forcing us to move the route, almost 2 years into the process.
So why was it moved so that it was so close to a home there and significant? I will scratch that. With the population of 70 H2A workers plus the other workers that are there.
I guess
instead of moving it somewhere else.
I'm not aware of any structure that has 70 workers. Or can you identify where on that property the 70 workers are living?
So
Yeah.
just real quick to clarify, Ms. Greenhagen and Mr.
Yes.
Schovanec, those are two different parcels. And so instead of just saying the green spot, can we just make sure we're talking about the green spot on the east and the west side of the road?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you.
you.
So the green area on the east side of the road, I believe Mr. Fair testified that there were two hog buildings, two hog barns that were built there. And that's what you're referencing, that those barns
Yes.
would have conflicted with the route.
Yes.
Okay. How long does it take to build a hog barn?
I don't know the answer to that.
But because it's a structure, it took some time to build, I would assume.
Correct. I know that the construction started after, I believe, after the Exhibit H's were filed and the route had been set. And that's why we had to file an amendment to adjust the route as shown.
And the Exhibit H's were, I think, completed in September of 2022.
That's right.
And so these barns were built after September of 22.
I believe so. I don't know the exact timeline of this specific parcel. So if that's untrue, then I stand to be corrected. But I know that we were aware of activities that were taking place. We were aware of this for a long period of time and trying to see if we could work this out, and trying to see if that was a more favorable location, still hugging the south side of the property near a hog confinement barn versus closer to their residence. And ultimately, I believe we didn't get any direction from them, so we made the decision to route further away from the existing barns that were built and go to the north side of the residence, which I believe we're 400 or 500 feet away from at this point.
I believe during testimony it was measured at 250 feet. And if we could zoom in on the west parcel that's in green. And I may get this wrong, but he did identify which buildings they were living in on the site. And I believe the one that has the rounded roof was their church. I think they even showed a video of it there. And they also stayed in some of the buildings on the site as well. We'll have to go back to that testimony as to exactly which buildings.
So that large building is the building that 70 plus people live in?
Yes, that's what he identified, yes.
And that's measured as 250 feet from the pipeline?
That is what the testimony was, yes.
Is there any way that we could measure that? So 310 feet, okay.
And I believe there were people also in the other building that's a little bit closer as well.
So this is, kind of that looks like a dilapidated structure, but, this is an example of a location where, landowners would be concerned that, hey, this is a little too close for me. Would you mind adjusting the route, further to the north? And we certainly have done that every single time it's been requested. If landowners are not willing to work with us or give us any feedback, we don't just arbitrarily move the route without any kind of direction.
So it seems that this particular one was changed after September of 2022.
Correct.
And so were there any conversations with the landowners after September 22 about the move?
Certainly there would have been communications. I'd have to defer to our right-of-way team on what those would be, but we've got a communications log of all correspondence with landowners.
Thank you. Could we also pull up SI-076? Then zoom out just a little bit. To the south of that red parcel, there's another hog building. You can zoom in on that. Do you recognize that as a livestock barn?
Yes.
Can you measure the distance between the pipeline and the livestock barn? Can you read that distance?
Yeah, it looks 60 feet.
Would your routing team view that as a land use conflict?
I mean, not necessarily. You know, there's instances, you know, very few instances like this where, you know, landowners would have requested us to, you know, hug their property line, which would, you know, put the pipeline, you know, closer to the adjacent landowner structures, for example. You know, we certainly tried to, you know, mitigate issues there. If there was a dwelling, if there was a hog confinement, you know, barn, for example, we didn't necessarily, you know, adjust that further away. You know, it's one of those things where, you know, we're working with the landowner in question that has the pipeline on their property. Obviously, adjacent landowners, you know, have impacts as well. But, you know, as I stated earlier, we didn't reach out or discuss, you know, all route changes with existing adjacent landowners. There are instances of, you know, well, my neighbor doesn't want this or whatever, and we've adjusted the route to accommodate neighbors' concerns on individual landowners' properties. I don't recall this being one. That doesn't necessarily mean that the landowner's not concerned.
So Summit would not have had discussions with the owner of this building, in all likelihood.
I can't say that they would have. I know that there are situations like this where our construction management team did go reach out to these landowners and, you know, talk to them and see, you know, if they were concerned. But I don't have a detailed analysis on this one to know what was done or not done. And I believe this was Mr. Utesh, correct?
Yes.
So, you know, if Mr. Utesh requests that we move this route, we certainly can.
So what we learned was the Mr. Utesh that owns the parcel for Exhibit H is not the same Mr. Utesh that owns the hog building.
And
is something we learned during testimony.
And then I think it was maybe part of the confusion with something like this, where we're hugging a property line. The landowner seems to be more agreeable with this alignment, and it was the same last name, assuming that it could be the same person or family member, etc. So,
in this instance, that wasn't the case. So,
okay.
Because we had that conversation with him,
yep.
Because I was curious about that. Okay. Let's look at WO-041. Do these parcels look familiar?
Generally.
There was testimony that there's irrigation systems on both of these parcels, as well as a parcel to the north that's owned by the same owner. But what I want to ask about is there's quite a few residences in this area as well. Mm-hmm. The one specifically that is to the north of the east parcel with the irrigation circle, if you can measure from that house to the pipeline. Can you read that distance?
Yeah, 160 feet.
So is this another instance where the pipe is pushed up against the boundary line, but the adjoining parcel was not, they're not an easement grantor, and they're not an Exhibit H? You know, were they consulted about the pipeline being that close to their home?
I would say that's most likely correct. If it was again, if you zoom out, I believe that there's houses on the south side of the property. So obviously, the landowner does not want us just bisecting the middle of his pivot irrigation. They prefer that we hug more of a property line, and so you got competing and conflicting priorities and interests there.
But Summit still decided to route the pipeline through this area.
Correct.
And why would that be?
Well, I don't have the macro look at this area, but I'm sure you'd have similar issues across this entire area, and I can't speak to all the other existing factors that were identified in this specific location on the route. I know that there's existing pipeline infrastructure in this general location. There's power lines, and again, as I mentioned yesterday, pipelines can co-locate. We've done an analysis, and there's tens of thousands of structures within vicinities of this close to a pipeline existing right now in Iowa. So, although not ideal, these instances are happening, every day, all day in Iowa, across the United States as well. So we try to mitigate these issues where we can, but there are, select, locations where this is occurring.
In fact, there's 112 of those locations according to the list.
112 that are within 400 feet, and I can't identify how many of those are actually immediately adjacent to an ethanol plant or other location that we have no choice on how we route it to.
With this particular parcel, is it in the vicinity of an ethanol plant?
It is not.
Okay, thank you. We're going to pick one more example, and then we'll move on to a different topic here. Could you pull up WR-002 and WR-0019? They're adjacent parcels. WR-002 and WR-019. There's also testimony regarding this parcel. No, this is not a structure issue here, the question here. I just want to show the two parcels, and we may need to pull up the landowners' exhibits. But there was testimony regarding some very large county tile going through here, and multiple laterals and county tile going through these properties.
Okay.
And so can we pull up, I believe it was Ritter Hearing Exhibit 1. I just want to show you what the parcels look like, and then he has a tile map that he shows some of that detail.
And just for your information, so we've digitized all of the drain tile maps that have been given to us, and we've overlaid that within our GIS platform. We've also got, all the county publicly available digital county tile information. So we do know where the majority of the county tile is located, and we have made adjustments to the design and the route to try to accommodate that where we can.
And I believe you Summit has been provided this map, but this is the pattern tile, and you can see the line. There's a line that traverses, how to describe it, on the east side of the west parcel, going north and south.
The one that heads in the northwesterly direction to the north of the parcel as well, yeah.
Yes. So that's he identified that as Mr. Ritter identified that as a county main, and then there's in that same parcel going from, I guess, up in the northwest corner, there's also a county lateral going through there at a diagonal.
Yes.
Okay. And then there's also another one on the south side as well, on the southeast side.
All the tile that leaves his parcel, or their parcel, are the county mains, is what you're saying?
Yes. With this many county mains on the property, how does your routing team usually accommodate that?
Well, you know,
Like, I'm sorry, I believe it's like a 28-inch pipe, 18 and 16, or the sizes of the drainage tile, if that helps.
Okay. You know, so that is one factor, obviously, is the size. I know that one of the other landowners testified to a 48-inch, you know, tile. You know, something of that magnitude would very likely be a drill, and we would drill that. You know, the depth of the tile obviously is part of the consideration as well. You know, if the tile is, you know, 4 or 5 foot deep, certainly we're going to go under. The tile's 10, 12, 15 foot deep, then, you know, based on the diameter of the pipe and the depth of cover and the expected separation between the tile and the pipe, you know, in my estimation, it's less impactful to go over the top of the tile. So I think it's really site specific and location and tile specific. You know, whenever we start our construction process, you know, we're going to identify large, you know, tiles such as this, and we're certainly working with the drainage districts to identify concerns like this and coming up with the most practical and you know, reasonable solution for constructing across these locations.
A couple follow-up questions to what you just said. How deep does the drainage tile need to be for the carbon pipeline to go over top of it, rather than underneath it? Is there a threshold?
I would say, you know, it's obviously specific to the diameter of the pipe. A 6-inch pipe is going to be buried. The ditch for the 6-inch pipe will be less deep than a 24-inch pipe. So taking a worst case, you know, largest diameter scenario, you know, we've committed to 4 foot minimum from top of pipe to top of soil. Typically when you're cutting your ditch, you'll cut the ditch, you know, 6 inches or a foot deeper than is actually needed, so that you can pad the ditch with good soil when you backfill, or when you're fixing the lower end of pipe. So just doing some math there, and then on top of the fact that we want to keep a minimum of 1 foot of separation between the tile and our pipe, preferably 18 inches or more. So, you know, 4 foot deep plus 2 foot of pipe plus an extra foot on the ditch depth plus another foot of separation, 8 foot deep, would probably be the minimum depth that we would try to tile over, or, you know, put the pipe over the top of the tile.
Does it matter whether it's perforated tile or non-perforated tile?
I wouldn't think so.
You may not know the answer, but do you know the difference between the functions of perforated tile versus non-perforated tile?
I don't. You know, so whenever we're actually cutting the ditch, you know, the surface impacts above that tile will be very minimal. I don't know if the concern was that, you know, for example, in the travel lane, if you're driving over the top of the tile, there's, you know, ground disturbance. Those types of concerns, I think, would not be there for, you know, cutting the ditch over the top of the tile and laying the pipe.
I'm going to try not to testify, but I'm just going to explain very briefly. So perforated tile performs a drainage function. Non-perforated tile is more just transport of the water. And so the perforated tile, that's why I was asking about that, is because it performs a drainage function and pulls water from the soil.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm familiar with perforated tile.
Okay.
You know, we certainly have a drain tile expert, you know, that's going to testify, I believe, later today. So more detailed questions would need to go to him.
Yeah.
But thanks.
Yeah, that's what I was just asking, at the depth, if there was a difference in consideration for the depth of the tile for the pipe to go over it as to whether it's perforated or non-perforated. Would it be better to ask Mr. Ellingson that question?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, we'll do that. A Okay, we'll switch subjects here. In your rebuttal testimony on page 7, you stated that pipelines are consistent with the vast majority of land uses. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Okay. Is there any land use that you would consider to be inconsistent with the pipeline?
In some of the ones I mentioned earlier, such as an airport, a cemetery, a school, there's, I think, a long list of those that are on the tables that were provided.
And you provided some rebuttal exhibits. Do you recall those?
Correct.
Okay. With those examples that were provided in, I believe, both the case study that was done in it, do those example pipelines transport substances that are used by people, such as natural gas and petroleum?
I would say that yes, some of them do, and I can't, testify to exactly what the uses are of those pipelines and what the end uses are. For example, Dakota Access transporting, crude oil from North Dakota to Illinois. Somebody is going to be using that, but I wouldn't, I don't think you can say that that's going to be used by anybody in the vicinity of that pipeline per se.
Would it make sense to you that in a community that maybe uses natural gas as a heating source, that there would have to be a natural gas pipeline go to that community?
I would say that a large diameter transmission line for natural gas does not have to be near the vicinity of development, but they do exist in that way. The small diameter distribution lines that go to individual residences certainly need to go to those houses, but the large diameter pipelines do not need to be in the near vicinity of any major establishments, from what I can tell.
Wouldn't there need to be a transmission pipeline to come to the community in order to put it into distribution lines?
Certainly, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in developed areas, which they do exist, to the tune of tens of thousands of structures just in Iowa alone.
Do any of the examples that you provided in your rebuttal exhibits transport liquefied carbon dioxide?
No.
Do communities ever use liquefied carbon dioxide for their homes or anything?
No, communities don't use liquefied natural or CO2 for their homes.
Were any of those pipelines in your rebuttal exhibits 2 and 3 intentionally located in close proximity to those occupied structures? Or did those occupied structures come later?
I have no knowledge of exactly which structures were there when the pipelines were constructed.
I believe your exhibits identify that. So just 1 second.
Are you referring to the 3 pipelines in the Harris case, or pipeline case proximity study, or the exhibits? The other
yes,
exhibits?
And there were photos identifying that the structures were built afterwards.
Yeah,
in
and
your exhibits.
on those specific pipelines, yes, the development did occur after the pipelines were installed, but those were a micro snapshot of the locations where the development did occur. I can't, state what other infrastructure or structures were in the near vicinity of those pipelines outside of the locations identified in that study.
Isn't there a difference between choosing to locate your home somewhere versus having something come in when you didn't ask it to come in to the neighborhood?
I would say yes, there is a difference.
Okay. I have another hearing exhibit. And we'll just, this is going to be IFBF hearing exhibit 5. There's more pages to this one. If there's not enough, there we have some more. On page 6 of your direct testimony, while they're handing that out, we can just starting on line 21 of page 6. You identify an environmental construction plan.
Correct.
Okay. And that's to, in the testimony, it's to use to mitigate environmental impacts during construction.
Correct.
Okay. Were you involved in reviewing this document?
Yes.
Okay. Have you had a chance to look at it in front of you there?
So this is just a copy of our environmental construction plan.
Okay. Is that the document that you were referencing in your direct testimony?
Correct.
Okay. And it's, I believe it's dated January of 2022.
Correct.
Is there a more recent draft of that document?
Not that I'm aware of. I believe that this is the most recent version, but I can certainly check on that.
And when will Summit finalize this environmental construction plan? Approximately, if you know.
I would say that, this is probably in final form at this point. The only thing that I would say that could lead to changes in this, and John Schmidt, who will testify later, is certainly, better versed in all the, environmental construction, best management practices and everything else that's detailed in this document. But, to me, this is a final form. If we get some sort of guidance or recommendations on changes here from the Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Natural Resources, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, for example, then we would incorporate those changes at that time.
Is Summit willing to include this document as a part of its pipeline permit?
Certainly. Yes.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about the document. If it's not something that you're familiar with, then just let me know who I should talk to about it. But I'm not going to get too in-depth on this because I understand you're the more of the overview guy on this, right?
Yeah, and just to put it into perspective, so this environmental construction plan will be used in conjunction with the AIMP, and if there's anything that's conflicting, between the two, we'll use the more stringent requirements, which is usually the AIMP, and this touches on obviously some additional items that the AIMP does not get into.
Just for the record, what does AIMP stand for?
Agricultural Impact Mitigation Plan.
And that was submitted as Exhibit I with the permit application?
Correct.
And it was last revised, I believe, August 22nd? Do I have the date right?
Yeah, I think there was some simple revisions, one of which was just updating the list of county inspectors.
Okay. So with the environmental construction plan on page 19, under section 5.0, in that first sentence there, it says wetland delineations will occur before construction. Has that occurred already?
Correct. So, part of the surveys that we conducted were, what I call biosurveys, biological surveys, and part of what they're doing are wetland delineations. So I believe we surveyed well over 97%. It could be as high as 99% of the Iowa route. And we've done, the wetland delineations as required. We've presented all of that information to the Army Corps of Engineers. I believe they had additional wetlands that were layered on, and we've incorporated those into our design. And the engineering design of our workspace, for example, we necked down the right-of-way in those locations. We're required to place mats at those locations, for example. But so we have completed wetland delineations for the vast majority of the pipeline route.
So when you said you did a survey for wetland delineations, is that just involving talking to the Corps, or was there a visual?
It's in-person field surveys, walking the entire route. Okay. With biologists.
Did Summit only consult with the Army Corps of Engineers regarding the wetland delineations, or did Summit also talk to the NRCS?
I'd have to defer to John Schmidt on that. I would imagine that we did talk to NRCS and other regulatory agencies, but I don't have the specifics on that.
We'll talk to him about that. Then on page 24, at the top of the page, it talks about seed mixing. See if we can find it. I may have the wrong page because I don't see it. Oh, scroll down just a little bit more. Still page 24, just scroll down a little bit more. There we go. It's at the bottom of the page. According to this environmental construction plan, Summit is going to be reseeding the areas that are not in crop production. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I'll just jump in for just a second, just to clarify the record. There are actually 3 different page numbers on every page of this document.
Yes.
And I believe on the prior question, when Ms. Grunhagen referred to page 19, she was talking about the number at the bottom, SCS, SC, and then the number. And on this one, I believe we're using the page number from the top, the IFBF hearing exhibit. So just for clarity of the record, I just want to make sure we use the same page numbering or explain which page numbering we're using when we're moving through the document, if we could. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blinsky. I appreciate that. And I believe I may have put page numbers down in my notes before I labeled them here for the exhibit. So why don't we scroll down to the SCS page number 24 at the top of the page. So just scroll to the next page here. There we go. And it talks about specific seed mixes there in the beginning. First paragraph of SCS page 24. And so it requires the seed mixes to be consistent with the type of habitat, county, or state regulation. Do you see that in the first sentence there?
I do.
Okay. If a federal contract, guidance, or regulation requires a certain type of vegetation, such as pollinator habitat for CRP, will Summit use the appropriate pollinator seed mix for the federal regulations?
We will.
Okay. Is Summit willing then to amend the ECP to include also federal contracts, guidance, and regulation?
We can.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have for that document. Your Honor, I would like to offer into evidence IFBF Hearing Exhibit 5.
No objection. Hearing no objections, the board will admit IFBF Hearing Exhibit 5.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Is this one not titled Exhibit 5 as well? Oh, so we're admitting it, sorry. Okay.
Yes. Yes, the ECP, we were just discussing admitting that into evidence.
Okay. So we can make those amendments that you suggested, and then I will check to see if we can deem this, final, and then add that part of the record.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Okay, we're going to switch topics again to talk a little bit about land restoration activities. In your direct testimony on page 9, starting on line 4, you state that successful restoration and revegetation of the project workspace is important for landowner relations, maintaining productivity, and protecting the underlying soil from potential damage. Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
What do you think are the most important aspects of achieving successful restoration of agricultural land?
Certainly separation of the topsoil and the subsoil prior to construction starting, I think, is one of the most critical items that can take place. Protecting the drain tile, properly repairing the drain tile. I think those are some of the critical items, and then stabilization of the topsoil during the construction process. And I know that since the Dakota Access Pipeline was installed, that there were a lot of changes to the Chapter 9 board rules to address, I believe, all of those items. So those, to me, are the largest, restoration considerations.
Prior to Dakota Access, wasn't topsoil already required to be separated from the subsoil and stabilized?
I believe that the stabilization was not a requirement. I'd have to defer to Aaron DeJoya, who's got the specifics on that, who will be testifying later today or tomorrow. But I believe that there was some enhanced language around topsoil stabilization.
But topsoil was already required to be separated from the subsoil.
I believe so, yes.
And wasn't tile lines, they were already required to be repaired?
They were required to be repaired. I know that in my experience working on, projects that involve tile, best practices are to, telescope the tile on both sides of the right-of-way to make sure that the tile wasn't crushed during, restoration activities through travel, through the travel lane, for example. My understanding is that telescoping of the tile was not a requirement for Dakota Access, and it now is. So that would be another example of enhanced kind of requirements.
When you state in there on page 9 that you will protect the underlying soil from potential damage, do you mean both the topsoil and the subsoil, or what did you mean by that?
So the subsoil to me is the damage that occurs there. And again, I'm not a soil expert, would defer to Mr. DeJoya on that, would be compaction of the subsoil. And, we're certainly going to decompact as required by the board rules and the AIMP. So that to me is a way to mitigate the issues from the subsoil compaction.
Part of the AIMP talks about wet conditions, construction of wet conditions. And I believe it provides an option for Summit to remove the topsoil in the traveled way and to be able to continue construction. Am I paraphrasing that correctly?
I believe that's correct, and I believe the language is, verbatim from the board rules.
So if that is done and it's in wet conditions and that subsoil is also saturated, can you explain why running heavy construction equipment over the subsoil won't cause compaction?
I'd have to defer to Mr. DeJoya. I know that there are things you can do to mitigate compaction, such as placing mats down in wet conditions, and other means to mitigate those issues. But we need to defer to Mr. DeJoya on specifics.
Okay, we'll talk to him about that. In your testimony, I believe this is the direct testimony, page 3. Lines 12 through 14. You talk about a easement of 110 feet wide for construction.
Correct.
And I believe the statute talks about 75 feet. Can you explain why that additional amount of feet is necessary for construction?
So, the construction footprint does range from 100 to 110. I believe the breaking point for the increased additional 10 feet is 16-inch pipe and above. So the 12-inch pipe and below the temporary easement is only 50 foot wide. It's 60 foot wide for the larger pipe. The width of the easement is needed primarily due to the topsoil. When you strip off, 18 inches, 2 feet, 3 feet of topsoil, you have a very large topsoil pile that takes up a very large footprint. So that's the primary reason on the width of the temporary easement.
And so you need more than the 75 feet under the statute in order to store topsoil?
Correct.
Subsoil. Okay. And if the top of page 4 of your rebuttal testimony. You provide an example of why Summit might, and we talked about this a little bit already, I just want to make sure we're clear on it. You provide an example of why Summit might install a pipe above a drain tile. With that, are there any other, any other reasons why that might occur?
No, there's the reasons I mentioned earlier are the reasons.
Are you also in charge of hiring the contractors for this project and overseeing them?
I am.
Can you name who the primary contractors are for this project?
I can. So we're using 3 contractors in the state of Iowa. They're all union contractors, which means that they're going to be required to hire 50% local. So there'll be a lot of local jobs utilizing union contractors. So our 3 contractors are Precision, Rockford, and Associated.
Were any of those contractors used during the Dakota Access Project, to your knowledge?
Precision was.
With the process of, were you involved in the topsoil surveys, or would you be familiar with that, or would that be a different witness?
I'm certainly aware of them and involved from a high-level standpoint. Specific questions about what those are would need to be directed to Mr. DeGioia.
I'll ask a couple of high-level questions, and then if I get too detailed, then just feel free to tell me that. Okay?
Certainly.
All right. Once Summit has conducted the topsoil survey and has the results of that, and they share it with the landowner, what is the process, I guess, for sharing it with the landowner? Can you describe what that is going to be like?
I don't know if that's been fully flanged up yet, but certainly we'll follow the board rules and the AIMP. My understanding is that the data and the results of that will be presented to us from the company conducting those, which is actually Soil and Eco, which Mr. DeGioia is involved with. So he can give you the exact details, but whatever's typical through the board rules and the process there is what we'll do.
Has Summit thought through how they're going to handle the situations where landowners may not agree with that topsoil survey?
Certainly. We've had several landowners that have requested that we strip less topsoil than what was identified in the topsoil survey without them seeing the results. We've included clauses in our easement docs that reduces the depth of the topsoil to an identified amount. For example, if the landowner says, "Hey, I just want you to strip 1 foot of topsoil and I don't care what the topsoil survey says," then we're going to abide by what the landowner wants us to do. It'll be a part of the construction line list, which is given to the contractor, and they'll know exactly what depth of topsoil that they'll need to strip off, and the construction line list will be made available to the county inspectors as well. But those types of instances are being documented in the easement themselves.
So if a landowner is a landowner for which an Exhibit H has been filed, so there's not an easement on file at this point, are they going to be able to indicate their wishes for topsoil depth to be put in your line list?
I would say yes. At the time that the easement's executed, I would expect that they would want that language in the easement. There was another mechanism for us to document that. We certainly would incorporate that, but my expectation would be that those landowners would be treated the same as all other landowners that have signed easements.
So if a landowner wasn't aware that this was going to be an issue and their property, their easement is condemned, will they still be able to have a say in how much topsoil gets stripped off their property?
Specific, easement language conversations and how that works through condemnations is not my wheelhouse. So I would defer those conversations to those questions to Mr. Rory. But in my opinion, we certainly will work with all landowners to the very last day to incorporate language and things in the easement that are concerning and important to them.
On page 9, line 21 of your direct testimony, you talk about 38 access roads that are going to be built. Does that number sound correct?
Sure. There's a lot of numbers, but if that's what I wrote, then yes, at the time there was 38 access roads.
And I believe you also testified that gravel is going to be used on those access roads.
Potentially, yes.
In the instances that gravel is used on those access roads across the property, will Summit agree to remove all of the gravel, even if it's smaller than 3 inches in diameter?
Yes. So our intent is to, for any access roads, temporary access roads, I should say, we're going to restore them to original condition. And a lot of, at least in my experience, in a lot of situations, the landowner wants us to leave the improved road, and we'll certainly do that when requested. If not, we'll restore it to its original condition.
And I just have 2 final questions here, so that you'll get to have the rest of your day back here. During a deposition, we talked a little bit about staging areas. Do you recall that?
Correct.
Could you describe what a staging area is?
To me, a staging area would be either, a pipe yard, a mat yard, or a, contractor construction laydown yard.
And about how many acres would that take up?
They vary in size. I think they're anywhere from 5 to 15 acres, with the high end being for the pipe storage.
And have those locations been identified?
Preliminarily, I don't believe that we've secured or leased any of those yet, but I believe that we've identified all of them in Iowa and are working towards coming to terms with the owners of the properties.
And you're going to have lease arrangements with those owners?
Correct.
And you're not looking at eminent domain for that?
We are not.
Okay, very good. And then also during deposition, and I believe you also have some testimony as well, would you agree that each individual property along the route may have different crop yield outcomes as a result of the pipeline construction?
I would say yes. Would defer to Mr. DeJoya on his expertise in that field.
That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The board has several questions, so before we get to that, we will take a. We'll just take a quick 15-minute break and be back 9:35.
Okay.
Okay, it is 9:37. We are back on the record. I see Ms. Colas has her name tent up, and Mr. Fallon. Before we get to that, we need to get some clarification from Mr. Fallon. Are you seeking to represent Bold, Iowa?
Yes.
Okay. You were requested to make that motion in writing by the board, and that did not happen. Are you making that motion now to represent Bold, Iowa?
Yes, I spoke with somebody about this last week. Originally, I was probably going to be out of town, but due to family illness, schedule change, and I was able to be here. There were two other reps from our organization who were going to speak, but one of them now has health issues. The other one is wrapped up with some major farm equipment changes, so that leaves me.
Motion is granted.
Thank you.
Ms. Colas, proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Schovanec. I'm Jean Colas with Colas Family Farms. And I'll make it simple. I want to know, do you have equity ownership or any ownership in the applicant or any related Summit industries or entities?
I do.
Can you name what they are? I don't know if you can remember.
I have equity in the company. I guess that's all I can say.
In Summit, does it also include the Midwest Carbon Express?
Yeah, so I have equity in the Summit Carbon Solutions project.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Fallon.
Thank you. Good morning.